I was born into a wealthy and well-known family on Torrin Island, but despite all the riches and social standing, my childhood felt cold and empty. My parents had always hoped for sons strong, proud boys to carry on the family name. Instead, they got 2 daughters, and I was the younger one. From the beginning, it was clear I wasn't what they wanted. My mother rarely smiled at me, and my father barely acknowledged me unless it was to scold me or remind me of something I'd done wrong. There were no bedtime stories, no warm hugs, no kind words whispered in the dark. The house, though full of people and fine things, always felt silent and distant to me. My older sister was the only person who made me feel seen. She was 6 years older, already grown up in my eyes. But she always made time for me, even when she didn't have to. When I was small, I'd follow her around the garden, asking endless questions, and she'd never pushed me away. Sometimes she'd sneak me sweets from the kitchen, or sit with me when I couldn't sleep. She brushed my hair gently when it was tangled, and told me stories that made me laugh. I used to think she was like a soft light in a very dark house, but she left when I was just 12, marrying a man named Mr. Carew and moving far away to Dublin. I still remember the day she left. Everyone was celebrating. The house was full of laughter and music, but I couldn't stop crying. I stood by the window as their carriage pulled away, feeling like the only person who wasn't happy. My sister, the only one who truly cared for me, was gone. And after that, the silence in the house grew even deeper. My parents didn't change. If anything, they grew colder. Without my sister there, I felt completely invisible. Meals were eaten in silence, and no one asked how I was doing or what I cared about. I learned to stay quiet, to keep my thoughts to myself. It was a lonely way to grow up surrounded by wealth, but starved of love. Looking back, I think that's why my sister meant so much to me. She was my only warmth in a world that otherwise never made room for me. It had been almost a year since my sister left for Dublin with her new husband, Mr. Carew, when a letter arrived. I still remember the way my father read it at the breakfast table, his voice flat and readable. Mr. Carew wrote that my sister had fallen ill. She wanted to come back home to be near her family again. Something about that letter stirred something deep inside me. I felt worried, of course, but I also felt strangely hopeful. She was coming back. I missed her more than I could say. She had always been the kindest person in my life. The thought of having her back, even for a short time, made my heart feel lighter. They're leaving Dublin on Sunday, my father told me. They should arrive Tuesday evening. I marked the days carefully, counting each one. When Tuesday finally came, I could barely sit still. All day long, I listened for the sound of wheels on the gravel road, for voices at the door, for anything. But the hours passed, first morning, then afternoon, and then evening. Still no one came. By midnight, the house was still and dark, but I couldn't sleep. A strange restlessness came over me, like something was pulling at me from outside. I sat up in bed, listening. There it was again. Crying, a soft, mournful cry carried by the wind. I ran downstairs and shouted, "They're here." My father and I rushed to the door, flung it open, and stepped out into the cold night. But no one was there. No carriage, no lights. Just the sound of wind and that eerie, distant crying. We stood there together, confused and unsettled, unsure of what we had heard. "I heard it," my father said quietly. "Yes," I whispered. "So did I." But no one ever came. The next day, a man arrived at our door with devastating news. My sister had died early that morning around 1 o'clock. At the exact time, we had stood outside, waiting. It didn't make sense. How could we have heard her? How could we have felt her presence if she had already passed? I'll never forget that night. I think some part of her spirit came to say goodbye. But it also marked the moment everything inside me changed. From then on, nothing felt safe or certain again. The 2 years after my sister's death were the loneliest, darkest years of my life. It felt like time had stopped the night we waited for her at the door. After we learned she had died at the very hour we thought we were welcoming her home, something inside me just shut down. I stopped laughing. I stopped caring. I moved through each day like a ghost in my own life. I didn't talk much. And when I did, my voice didn't sound like my own. I was only 13, but I felt so much older, like the weight of grief had aged me. What hurt even more was how quickly Mr. Carew moved on. Barely a year had passed when we heard he had married another young woman in Dublin. It made me sick. How could he forget my sister so easily? How could he love someone else so soon? As if my sister's life had meant nothing. I didn't understand how someone could be so cold. The anger mixed with my grief, making everything inside me feel tangled and bitter. I wanted to scream at the world, but there was no one to listen. Around that time, something else began to change. Without my sister, I became the only child of a rich and respected family. That meant something to people. Before I was even 14, men began visiting our home suitors. They called them. They came dressed in their best clothes, full of compliments and polite smiles. But I saw through them. They didn't care who I was. They didn't ask what I liked or how I felt. They saw a young girl from a wealthy family, and they wanted a wife, a trophy, a prize. I hated it. I felt like I was being watched, measured, weighed. My mother was no help. She encouraged their visits, proud of the attention I was getting. But I wasn't ready. I didn't want to be a wife. I barely knew who I was. I still cried at night when I remembered my sister's voice, her laughter, her kindness. She had been so full of life, and now she was gone. And now these men were showing up, trying to step into a future I didn't ask for. I wasn't living, I was surviving, and deep down, I knew that my life was no longer my own. It was being shaped by grief, and by the expectations of others who didn't see the girl behind the name. When I turned 16, my mother decided it was time for a change. She had grown impatient, tired of watching me sit quietly in my grief, while the suitors she carefully invited left disappointed. One morning, without asking what I wanted, she announced, "We're going to Dublin. The men there are wealthier, more refined, and more interesting than the ones here in Torrin. You'll find a good husband there." I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy. At that point, I just wanted to escape the heavy silence of our house, where every room still reminded me of my sister. Dublin was loud, bright, and full of life. It was overwhelming at first. Carriages rattled down crowded streets, music poured out of buildings, and people everywhere seemed to be in a hurry to go somewhere. But slowly, something inside me began to stir. There were parties and dances almost every night, and young people who spoke with laughter in their voices and curiosity in their eyes. At first, I stood at the edges of the ballroom, stiff and unsure. But eventually, someone would ask me to dance. I would say yes, and then again, and again. Bit by bit, I started to come back to life. There was something about dancing that helped me forget. The movement, the music, the whirl of silk and candlelight. It distracted my heart just enough to stop aching for a while. I met people who didn't know my past, who didn't look at me with pity. I laughed. I began to talk more. And for the first time since my sister died, I caught myself smiling without guilt. Dublin gave me space to breathe again. But my mother wasn't satisfied. She watched me carefully at every gathering, always reminding me of who was watching, who had money, who was looking for a wife. She was polite, but underneath, I could feel her urgency. She didn't want me to just be happy, she wanted me married. Quickly, happiness comes after marriage, she said once, as if that were a fact. I didn't believe her, but I kept quiet. Even though my heart still carried the shadow of my sister's absence, something about Dublin gave me hope. I wasn't ready for marriage, but I wasn't drowning anymore either. For the first time in a long time, I began to imagine a future that didn't hurt quite as much. One night, as I was getting ready for bed in our small apartment in Dublin, my mother came into my room with that determined look she always wore when she'd made a decision on my behalf. "Do you know Lord Glenfallen?" she asked, sitting down on the edge of my bed. I shrugged. "You mean that older man from Killa? The one with the strange eyes? He's not exactly charming, Mother." She waved her hand like I'd said something ridiculous. "He's from one of the richest families in the country. He's not that old. And he wants to marry you. He says he loves you." I stared at her, stunned. "Loves me!" We had only spoken briefly at 1 or 2 parties. I didn't even know what his voice really sounded like. "But I don't love him," I said quietly. "I don't want to marry someone I don't love." My mother's voice softened in that way it did when she wanted something badly. "Fanny, he's a good man. You'll be safe, comfortable, and respected. This is a blessing. Think about how many girls would give anything for this chance." Then she kissed my forehead, stood up, and left me alone in the silence. In the end, I said yes, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't have the strength to fight anymore. The wedding happened in early spring. Everything was beautiful. The flowers, the guests, the music, it all looked perfect on the outside. But inside, I felt hollow, like I was walking through someone else's life. 2 days later, we said goodbye to my family and began the journey to Killa. I didn't know what to expect. When we arrived, I was surprised by the beauty of the estate. The house was tucked near a river, surrounded by trees and gardens bursting with flowers. Birds sang in the branches overhead, and for a moment I forgot everything. Standing beside my new husband, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a flicker of peace. "Come, my love," he said gently. "You must meet Martha. She runs the house and will take good care of you." I nodded, unsure of what came next, but willing to follow. The house seemed warm, full of life, dogs barking, women laughing in the kitchen. It didn't feel like the cold, silent home I had grown up in. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to think, maybe this could be a new beginning. That first night at Killa, everything began to change. After the long journey and a warm dinner with my new husband and the housekeeper, Martha, I felt strangely content. The house had a welcoming charm, fireplaces glowing, the scent of fresh bread in the air, and even the sound of dogs padding softly down the halls. It didn't feel like a place where dark things could happen. When Martha offered to show me to my bedroom, I followed her eagerly, my heart lighter than it had been in months. We stopped at a large wooden door at the end of the hallway. "This is your room, madam," Martha said with a kind smile and slowly opened the door. But the moment I stepped forward, I froze. There was something large and black, standing just inside the doorway. At first, I thought it was a coat hung carelessly on a chair. But there was no chair, and no shape beneath the coat. It just hung there in the air. My blood went cold. I stumbled backward, too frightened to speak. Martha turned to look at me. "Is something wrong, madam?" I shook my head, unsure. "No, it's nothing. I thought I saw something. Just a coat, maybe." but her face had gone pale. Her hands trembled slightly as she stepped into the room. "There's nothing here," she whispered, though it sounded more like she was trying to convince herself. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house made me jump, and then sometime after midnight, I woke with a start. Someone was in the room. I couldn't see her at first, just the soft outline of a woman standing near the window. She turned slowly, and I saw her eyes clouded, unseeing. She was blind. Her voice was low, calm, but chilling. "You don't belong here," she said. "I am Lady Glenfallen, not you." My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear anything else. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. The woman just stood there, silent, as if she were waiting for me to understand something I couldn't grasp. And then she was gone. In the morning, I told my husband. His face went pale, just like Martha's had. "You must never go to the rooms at the back of a house," he said quickly. "Don't listen to her. You are my wife. She is not." But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. That woman was real. I could still feel the cold in the room where she stood. And I knew she hadn't come to welcome me. She had come to warn me. I couldn't stay silent any longer. After that night, the vision, the voice, the chill that hadn't left my bones, I knew I had to understand what was happening. My husband refused to speak of it. Every time I brought it up, his face turned cold and his words grew sharp. "You're imagining things," he snapped once. "Don't go looking for ghosts." But I had seen her. I heard her. I wasn't losing my mind. So I went to the one person I thought might tell me the truth, Martha. She was in the kitchen early one morning, kneading bread with her sleeves rolled up, flour dusting her arms. When I walked in, she looked at me, really looked at me, and I think she knew right away why I was there. "Please," I said quietly, my voice almost shaking, "tell me who she is, the blind woman. I need to know." Martha sighed and wiped her hands on her apron. "Sit down, madam," she said softly. "What I'm going to tell you, it isn't easy to hear." So I sat, and she began. "She was his wife once, Lady Glenfallen. She lived in this house before you. No one knows much about her. She wasn't from here, and she didn't have family close by. But everyone knew she was different, quiet, lonely, and very much in love with her husband." I felt my stomach twist. "She died one night," Martha continued, her voice low. "We found her in her room at the back of the house. Her eyes were gone, cut out. A knife was lying next to her body." Martha paused. "Some say he did it. No one proved anything, but someone saw him that night, holding a knife, standing outside her door." My hands were cold. I could barely breathe. "Why?" I asked. "Why would he do that to her?" Martha looked at me, her eyes full of sorrow. "Maybe he didn't want her to see the next woman. You." I felt sick. Everything inside me turned to ice. I stood up, dizzy, barely able to steady myself. I didn't want to hear more. I didn't want to know what else lay buried in this house. All I knew was that I had to leave. Whatever love I had hoped to find here was a lie. The warmth of Killa had turned into something dark and haunted. And the woman in black, she wasn't just a ghost. She was a warning. I didn't wait another day. After Martha told me the truth, I packed my bags and left Killa before the sun went down. I didn't even say goodbye to my husband. I couldn't. I didn't want to see him, not after what I knew. I was too afraid to spend one more night in that house, afraid that the blind woman would return, not just to speak, but to take me with her. I traveled back to Torrin Island in silence, staring out the carriage window the whole way. The countryside blurred past, But all I could see in my mind were her eyes, those empty, hollow spaces where sight used to be. I wondered if her soul had ever rested, or if it still wandered the halls of Killa, waiting for someone else to suffer like she had. Back home, things felt different. My mother and father, so distant before now, spoke to me more gently. Maybe they saw something in my face they couldn't ignore. Maybe they realized I was all they had left. The house was quieter than ever, but it no longer felt cold. I found peace in the silence. At night, my sister visits me in dreams. I don't fear her. She stands near my window, calm and soft, and tells me things I don't always understand. But one thing she says never changes. The blind woman is still looking for you, but she can't find you here. I believe her. I think the blind woman wants what she lost: her name, her place, her peace. But that house, that man, that life, it's no longer mine to carry. And I've learned something that no amount of wealth or status can teach you. You can have the finest home, the richest husband, the most beautiful garden, and still feel trapped in a nightmare. Love without trust is not love. A life built on fear and silence will always crack open, no matter how well you decorate it. I was taught to obey, to marry well, to smile when told. But no one ever taught me how to listen to my own voice until I was nearly lost. Now I know better. Sometimes survival means running. Sometimes strength is choosing to walk away, even when the world expects you to stay. I don't know what became of Lord Glenfallen. I don't ask, but I do know this. The ghosts we carry with us, whether memories or regrets, only grow louder when we pretend they're not there. And the only way to silence them is to face the truth and finally let go.